When Jason Cruz finally agreed to join my family as a live-in son-in-law, my parents could hardly contain their joy, their voices trembling with excitement as they urged me to pick out a house that would serve as our wedding gift. And my father, without hesitation, wired $10 million into my account, telling me that it was rare to find a man willing to mentor a family this way and that we must never let him feel shortchanged, reminding me again that a woman who wanted a solid career needed a husband who could balance the home, and I listened with respect, believing that everything he said was true. Before we left to look at homes, I told Jason that the house should carry both our names, that it would be not just our marital home, but also a sign of security for him. And he looked at me with that tender smile I used to adore, slipped his arm over my shoulders, and said softly that as long as he could marry me, it did not matter whose name was on the deed. What was mine would be his. And I smiled, wanting to believe in the sincerity of those words. That morning, I took half a day off from work, feeling almost giddy as I borrowed my brother's Rolls-Royce for the occasion, and as we drove under the bright Nevada sky toward the Strip, I chattered happily about the appointment I had already set with a real estate consultant I knew, thinking of how special it would be to walk into a penthouse worth $5 million, to imagine it filled with flowers and laughter and our future. Yet halfway down the road, Jason suddenly slammed the brakes, the screech echoing down the boulevard, my body jerking forward. As I clutched at the seat, startled, my heart pounding, as I turned to him and asked why he stopped. When we were only 500 meters from our destination, his eyes were drawn to the left side of the street, his lips pressed together before he finally spoke, saying that the row of houses at Maplewood Estate across the way did not look so bad, and he asked if I wanted to go there instead, since, as he said, I loved maple leaves. My heart froze for a second because I had never once said I loved maple leaves. I loved roses, I always had. And the way he spoke, as if confusing me with someone else, made my stomach twist with unease. But before I could question him, he had already turned the wheel, crossed the street, and parked in front of the Maplewood Estate gates. He pulled me out of the car with an eagerness that felt strange, almost unnatural, and I whispered a cautious question, asking him what was wrong. Because Jason had always been calm, composed, measured, never impulsive like this. Yet before he could answer, a woman in uniform standing at the gates lifted her head at the sound of my voice. Her eyes widened the moment she saw Jason, her face flickering with a shock that sent a chill down my spine. And when her gaze shifted to where Jason's hand gripped mine tightly, she looked at me with something that was not just surprise, but something sharper, almost regretful, almost bitter. Jason, as if wanting to be seen, slammed the car door shut with a deliberate bang, the sound reverberating across the driveway, and then he brushed a few strands of hair away from my face with studied tenderness, raising his voice as he said that meeting me had been the greatest blessing of his life. I instinctively stepped half a pace back, pulling away from his gesture, because I knew Jason was not a man who liked public displays of affection. He had always told me such gestures were childish, shallow, unnecessary, and now he was putting on a show loud and theatrical for the eyes of this particular woman. As we walked inside, I noticed the woman's gaze following him, following us. Her eyes unfocused, her expression dazed, as if she could not look away. And it was then I knew her reaction was not just shock, but loss, the kind of look that comes when something precious slips through your fingers. Inside the model home, another employee greeted us, her name tag reading Vang, and she gestured for us to view the layouts. I tried to focus to picture myself in the open kitchens and high-ceilinged living rooms, but none of the designs stirred my heart, so I asked politely if she could show us a better option, something that might match the grandeur my parents envisioned. She lifted her eyes briefly to scan me from head to toe, and then she looked away in silence, her lips sealed as if I did not exist. At first, I thought perhaps she had not heard, so I asked again, my voice steady, but she remained unmoved, her eyes cold, her body angled toward Jason. as if every syllable from me was nothing more than background noise. The more I spoke, the more certain I became that she was deliberately ignoring me, her indifference sharp as a blade. Yet when Jason's voice cut in, her entire posture transformed. Her face brightened with eagerness, her words spilling over themselves as she leaned toward him, answering every question, offering every detail, her tone dripping with syrupy courtesy that was almost grotesque in its excess. I stood there, my hands tightening around the strap of my purse, the anger rising like fire beneath my skin, because it was not only the insult of being treated as invisible, but the humiliating way she bent herself into honeyed sweetness for the man who should have been mine alone. Every time I opened my mouth, that woman pretended not to hear, her eyes sliding past me as though I were air. But the moment Jason Cruz spoke, her entire body changed. Her voice leapt to life, warm and eager to the point of absurdity, and the way she leaned toward him with that forced sweetness made fury burn slowly in my chest. I was just about to say something when Jason lifted his hand and pointed toward the most extravagant villa in the center of the estate, declaring in a steady tone that he wanted to buy that one. My heart skipped a beat, because I knew that property was not only the most expensive of the entire development, but also the least liquid, the kind of investment that trapped money in stone, and it was far beyond the budget my father had given us. The woman's eyes lit up instantly, her excitement obvious as she launched into a stream of details about the villa, her lips moving endlessly until her throat grew hoarse, her smile stretching too wide. But Jason silenced her with the faint wave of his hand, his voice cutting cool and low as he told her to stop talking and call Rachel Moore instead. I froze, my pulse quickening as I wondered who Rachel Moore was. But Jason offered no answer, only that same half-smile tugging at his lips. The woman's excitement collapsed, her expression stiffening as she stumbled through an awkward protest, insisting that she could present the villa just as well, that the price would not change no matter who showed it. Asking if Jason had arranged an appointment with Rachel beforehand, her eyes flicking up and down his body, calculating whether he truly had the wealth to match the boldness of his demand. Jason wore the newest Louis Vuitton suit that day, his wrist flashing with a $200,000 watch, a gift from my father, after Jason agreed to become his son-in-law, while I felt dressed in designer from head to toe, looked too professional, too composed, like a corporate executive, rather than the daughter of a wealthy family. And next to him, I suddenly felt less dazzling. Jason tilted his chin, tugging at his collar, the corner of his mouth curling into a smile that carried more arrogance than charm, repeating that he wanted Rachel Moore, and that if she did not come, he would not buy. He said she worked there, so she should be brought in to advise us, and the command in his voice brooked no refusal. At last the woman hurried off, and only moments later, the young woman I had noticed outside earlier, the one whose eyes had lingered on Jason in shock, walked into the room. So it was her Rachel Moore, and as she stepped forward, I could not stop myself from watching Jason's gaze fall upon her, seeing the way his eyes burned, as if he had forgotten the world around him. For the first time, I studied her carefully, her porcelain skin, her wide gaze, her delicate figure. But most of all, it was the way she looked back at him, her expression trembling with some emotion she could not hide. A sudden thought struck me like lightning, that they had known each other, that something had existed between them, and in that instant I understood why Jason had acted so strangely all day, why he had swerved the car into this estate, as though fate itself had pulled him here. Rachel bit her lower lip, her eyes reddening as tears shimmered her voice, shaking as she began to introduce the villa, saying it was the prime 200-square-meter property of the development. But before she could finish, her voice caught in her throat and she faltered. Despite the suspicion curling through my chest, I still extended a hand, offering her a tissue with polite concern, asking softly if she was all right, if she felt unwell. But she slapped my hand away with a sharp sound and pressed her face into her palms, sobbing her words, spilling out that Jason had brought me here only to humiliate her. My body stiffened, my lips parting in disbelief, but Jason did not even glance at me. His eyes locked wholly on Rachel, as if I had ceased to exist. His voice came low and firm, saying that she was just a saleswoman, and he had money, that asking her to serve him was no insult. I tugged at his sleeve, whispering that she did not look well, that another staff member could easily explain the villa, reminding him that we were not even planning to buy this place, that it did not matter who delivered the sales pitch. Yet Jason's gaze clung to Rachel, as though she were fire, and he was helpless against the heat, while she, after crying so bitterly, could not even meet his eyes again, shrinking under the weight of his stare. And if anyone had told me that there was nothing between them, I would never have believed it. But Jason was my fiancé, and I would not allow my position to be undermined. So I reached for his hand, deliberately lacing my fingers through his, and lifting my chin with a bright, practiced smile, reminding him gently that he had told me only a simple single-floor home would be enough, that my parents would be content with something modest. Yet he cut me off before I could finish, his voice sharp with pride, as he insisted that it was not about whether he could afford the villa, but about giving me the very best, so that the world would know that the woman who married him would always be the happiest. My heart fell heavy at those words, because they were spoken not to reassure me, but to perform for Rachel. And I swallowed back my frustration, thinking that if he was willing to live under my family's roof, perhaps I could endure a little more, telling myself that compromise was not defeat, even as something deep inside me began to fracture. I thought that once Jason settled down, once he accepted his place in my family, my parents would finally stop arranging blind dates with the sons of their friends. But as Rachel Moore turned her glistening eyes toward him, and then back at me, letting a single tear fall with the kind of sorrow that seemed too heavy for anyone to bear, I realized that peace was further away than ever. She looked like one of those tragic beauties you only read about, her tears falling, as though the sky itself mourned with her, and Jason was spellbound. His gaze locked on her, as if I no longer stood beside him. He even reached out slightly, as though he intended to take her hand, and her trembling voice excused herself, saying she had work to finish, asking another colleague to handle the presentation before she fled like a woman running from a wound too raw to touch. Jason's eyes followed her out, his entire being pulled away from me, and I could feel it, the way he was no longer present, the way a part of him had been carried off in her wake. I tapped my fingertips together lightly, forcing a small, mocking smile, because no matter how touching their reunion might be, I still had a wedding to secure. I had chosen Jason because he was handsome, educated, his background simple and free of the complications that came with wealth, and most of all, because he had always seemed distant from other women, as if he belonged only to me. The fact that he was not pure when we met had never bothered me, but now, at the threshold of marriage, with contracts ready to be signed and families aligned, it was as if the groom I had chosen suddenly sprouted wings and tried to fly away, and if I lost him now, I would not only face my parents' disappointment, but also the ridicule of my cousins, the smug laughter of relatives who would relish my failure. My father's anger would be the greatest blow, and that thought chilled me more than any heartbreak. Jason's look still counted for something, and I admitted I had always been susceptible to beauty, so I asked lightly if the woman was someone he knew. He lowered his gaze, a fleeting sadness passing over his face, before turning to soothe me, saying it was only an old friend and that I should not overthink. But I could feel the hollowness of his words. Another employee, sharp enough to read the tension, looked between us with raised brows and asked if we still intended to place a deposit, reminding us that a villa worth $5 million was no trivial decision, and it struck me how absurd it was to even consider spending that much for the sake of appearances. I waved my hand dismissively, saying we should just look at the single-floor unit again, but Jason cut in before the words had settled his finger, pointing once more to that same villa, insisting we be shown it. My irritation deepened, and I snapped quietly that my father had only given us $10 million. So where exactly did he plan to get the other 15? And he replied without a blink that we would borrow the rest from the bank and he would take care of it. I pressed my palm to my forehead, half in disbelief, half in anger, because I knew that whenever Jason said he would take responsibility, what he really meant was dipping into the profits of Pet Care Innovations, the pet accessory company I had built with my own hands. I asked why he was so obsessed with that particular villa, reminding him it was not a matter of a few thousand but 15 million short, but he stood firm, his jaw tight, as though I was the unreasonable one. My grandmother had never approved of me walking away from the family conglomerate to build my own business, and she rarely offered me financial help. So Pet Care Innovations was my lifeblood, the fruit of years of struggle and growth, finally stable, finally respected in the market. There was no way I would allow Jason to drain it just to feed his ego and impress an old flame. Yet he acted as if the decision was his, alone pulling out his card and tossing it on the table in front of the saleswoman, ordering her to call Rachel Moore back because he would sign the contract on the spot. My heart pounded as I watched him, my anger colliding with disbelief. Because it was not just reckless, it was betrayal. Moments later, the woman returned hesitant, her voice dropping as she explained that Rachel had left to take her daughter to the hospital for an IV treatment and would not be back today. Jason stiffened, the words, daughter and hospital, slicing through him like lightning. The saleswoman glanced at me, then a small, knowing smile curling on her lips, as she added that the child was the daughter of Rachel's former boyfriend, that she had found out she was pregnant after their breakup, that the little girl was already 2 years old, and though many had urged her to terminate the pregnancy, she had refused, clinging to her love. The room tilted around me as I realized the calculations racing through Jason's mind, the timeline aligning with the years we had been together, and sure enough, the next second he was already leaning forward, his voice urgent, demanding to know which hospital Rachel had gone to. I stared at him, suspicion sharpening into ice, and asked if the child was his, if he was about to tell me that our engagement was nothing but a farce built on his unfinished past. My voice was calm, but my body trembled because if that was true, this wedding was finished. He turned toward me with a forced smile, saying, of course not. That Rachel had only been the girlfriend of a college roommate, that she had left him for money, and now was struggling with a child, and he only wanted to confirm her situation to tell his old friend. His words were smooth, but the look in his eyes betrayed him, and I knew then that no explanation could erase what I had just seen, the way his soul had leapt at the mention of her daughter, as if part of him already belonged to another family. Jason insisted he only wanted to verify the situation and then inform his old friend, but I knew in my bones that the so-called friend he spoke of was himself. I let out a hollow laugh and told him to go ahead to see for himself. And yet he stood frozen in place, not moving toward the hospital as he claimed he would. I asked him again if he no longer wanted to go, and after a long hesitation, he finally opened his mouth and asked if he could borrow the card my father had given me. In 3 years together, Jason had always postured as if he were above money, never once mentioning financial needs, and I had once admired him for his supposed integrity. But in that moment, I understood he had simply never been desperate enough to show his true face. I denied him coldly 3 times, telling him that my father's money was strictly for the house, that it could not be used for anything else, but that I would transfer him his share of dividends from our joint account, $200,000 that belonged to him anyway. He smiled in false gratitude, thanking me for being generous, assuring me not to dwell on such a small matter, and yet my heart clenched with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. His eyes then wandered across the street where a car rental company stood, and he excused himself, saying he had to head to his store first, asking me to call if I needed anything, reminding me that he had reserved dinner at my favorite restaurant that evening. I smiled faintly and said fine, then watched him walk into the rental office before I hailed a cab to follow at a distance. They say that small expenses should not dictate life's great decisions, but if Jason truly intended to return to his old lover, then I needed to be decisive and cut him off before I fell in any deeper. He emerged behind the wheel of a rented Maybach, his urgency betraying him as he sped toward the hospital, too consumed by his obsession to notice the taxi trailing behind. As soon as he parked, a motorcyclist carelessly clipped the fender, leaving a harsh streak across the glossy surface of the car. But I paid no attention, heading straight into the pediatric infusion ward, where the cries of children echoed through the halls. From a distance, I heard Jason's voice raised in desperation, shouting at Rachel Moore as he pointed at the little girl in her arms. He demanded to know if the child was his, how she could dare to hold his daughter while abandoning him, how she could treat him as if he were nothing, and his voice rang with pride as he declared that he now had money, a villa, a luxury car, and his own company, that she would surely regret leaving him, that he was about to marry, and she had been the one to betray him first. His words were unhinged raw, ignoring the fact that they stood in a hospital corridor with people staring. And Rachel shook her head over and over, her tears spilling as she clung to her silence until she finally spoke through sobs. She told him her father had been paralyzed, that the medical bills had been unbearable, that when she discovered she was pregnant, she knew he would marry her out of obligation, but she could not bear to drag him down into the same pit of suffering. She said it was enough for her to fall alone, that she had never regretted their time together, that the child resembled him, that she had allergies like him, that she had carried the memory of his kindness, even through the darkest years, but that now she saw he was living well, and she could finally let go. She begged him to end it peacefully, to stop making her suffer, because if she lost her job, she would not be able to pay for school or treatment for her daughter. She said she had seen me, that he took care of me, that I was lucky while she was not worthy. And with that, she pushed him away and told him to leave. But Jason did not let go. He grabbed her face and forced a kiss upon her right there in front of the child, in front of the nurses and me, and the sight of it made me want to roll my eyes until they hurt. The little girl's IV needle nearly slipped from her tiny arm while they indulged in their melodramatic reunion. And it was in that moment I finally knew that whatever feelings I had once held this man was no longer the one I wanted. Later, while I was finishing work at my company, my phone rang and his name flashed across the screen. His voice was frantic as he asked me to transfer another $200,000 because the rental company was demanding $20,000 for damages after the accident, and he was short on cash, reminding me that the business was run by my cousin, asking me to smooth things over. I stared at the phone in disbelief. The same man who had just kissed another woman now remembered he still had a fiancé. I reminded him sharply that I had already given him $200,000 that very morning, but he stammered, saying he had used it to put down a deposit on the villa. My patience shattered, and I stormed to the sales office, confronting him in front of Rachel and the staff, my voice rising like fire as I demanded how he could gamble away a year of our hard work, how he could spend without blinking on a villa worth $25 million when he had once told me that money did not matter, when he had sworn love was more important than wealth. I pointed at him with fury, telling him he had changed, that he had become greedy, and calculating, no longer the man I had chosen. And for the first time, I saw his face flush with shame as he stood exposed under the weight of my anger. Jason had become calculating, consumed by numbers, and pride, no longer the simple man I had once believed in. And as my accusations poured out, his face flushed red, until at last he muttered that he would pay me back. I laughed bitterly, asking with what money he could possibly repay me, and just then Rachel Moore stepped forward, her eyes blazing as she placed herself in front of him, snapping that Jason was only trying to buy a better home for me, that I had no right to scold him like a spoiled heiress who had never lifted a finger in her life. Her words were so absurd I actually laughed out loud, because who was she to speak when I was disciplining my own fiancé, who gave her the right to interfere? And if she was so eager to play the mistress, she should go find her own stage rather than trespass on mine. She had picked the wrong rival, and I thought with amusement that while I had spent years fending off green tea girls scheming around my father, she had probably still been counting on her fingers at school. Jason, seeing his darling insulted, finally shouted for us to stop drawing every eye in the room as he declared furiously that he would buy the house under his own name. I almost laughed again because that very morning I had given him $200,000, which was all he had, and I wanted to see where exactly he planned to find the rest of the $25 million. I smirked and told him to go ahead, and he mistook my sarcasm for concession. His expression softening as he smiled and said, "This would be our marital home," begging me to hand over the final $1 million my father had entrusted to me, assuring me that I had always been the one with vision who could see the bigger picture. My eyes swept the room and landed on a strikingly handsome sales agent, and I lifted my hand to call him over. He hurried to me with a polite bow, asking what he could do for me, and I pointed to the single-floor apartment I had liked earlier, asking if it was still available. Jason's voice tightened with sudden panic as he told me not to be reckless, but the agent checked and his eyes lit up, confirming that the unit was indeed available, asking if I would like to see it again. I handed him my card right there and told him to finalize it, scoffing at the idea that only men could put on a show, because today I would prove that I too could make a statement. And Jason's face twisted when he realized the money he expected to fill his fantasy was now gone. What he did not know was that I had already set people to investigate his past with Rachel, and the truth that came back made me sick with both relief and disgust. The child she clung to so desperately was not his at all, but the result of a casual entanglement during one of her spa retreats, and unable to determine the father, she had hidden the truth and broken up with Jason instead. To make matters worse, she had named the girl Chloe Moore, a name dripping with false sentiment, pretending it carried pieces of Jason, when in fact it was a reminder of her own recklessness. It was nauseating, and though I pitied the little girl, I could no longer stomach Rachel's performance. My situation was entirely different because the child in my own womb truly belonged to Jason. Though he remained unaware, and I had already decided I would keep the baby, but not the man. At that very moment, Jason was still lost in the illusion of love, regained believing Rachel had been forced from him by fate rather than her own choices. And that evening he returned home, carrying the largest bouquet of roses I had ever seen, his voice thick with contrition as he apologized for losing his temper, begging me to forgive him, promising me that we would be together for life, if only I could be more tolerant. I held my car keys in my hand, telling him casually that my mother had called me back to the family estate for dinner because my grandfather's old friend would be visiting. Jason immediately brightened, rubbing my shoulders, eager to come along, but I smiled coolly and told him my grandfather had invited only me, and that if he insisted on coming, it would be better if he kept quiet. His face darkened with humiliation, but he still followed, unwilling to waste the chance to mingle. When we arrived, my grandfather's eyes lit with warmth at the sight of me, but when they slid over Jason, they grew colder, and after greeting me, he said he had prepared a wedding gift. I accepted politely and thanked him, and his associate produced a contract explaining that he had several pet food brands under his control and wanted to sign a 5-year partnership with my company. I scanned the pages quickly, noting the initial deposit alone was $30 million, enough to buy not only one villa, but to build multiple factories if I wanted. If this contract were to be signed, we would not just be able to buy a villa. We could invest in multiple new factories with money to spare. And clearly Jason Cruz realized the magnitude of it, because the hand that clutched mine trembled with excitement, yet I pulled away quietly so he could not hold on. He immediately stepped forward, interrupting with a voice almost frantic, as he assured my grandfather that he would dedicate himself fully to the partnership, bowing low as he accepted the contract as though it were sacred. And I wondered if his head had been struck one too many times, because if business were that easy, millions of companies would not fail every year. I understood why he clung to it so desperately, because if he failed, the $200,000 deposit for the villa would be lost. And if Rachel Moore discovered he had fumbled both love and money, she would see him for the hollow man he was. Still, he maintained the mask of dutiful respect, promising my grandfather that he would not disappoint. Then, without a second glance at the other elders in the room, he tucked the contract under his arm and hurried out, leaving me behind. Later that evening, my mother looked at me with worry asking softly if I truly intended to marry such a man, telling me he had no presence of a true provider, and I placed a hand on my stomach, smiling faintly as I told her not to worry. Jason was tall, healthy, whole in body, and if he was small-minded, it was only because he had grown up without proper guidance. As for my child, I would raise him or her myself into someone strong, someone better, and my mother said, no more. I thought I would simply devote myself to work for a while, and then discard Jason at the right moment, but he moved quicker, handing me what he thought was a gift, but what I knew was poison. That morning, as I lay in a spa chair, a mask cooling on my skin, my phone buzzed and my assistant Samantha Green's trembling voice spilled through the line. She told me our lead sales representative Tracy Newman had just been dismissed. I bolted upright, the mask sliding to the floor, demanding to know who had dared, and she stammered that it was CEO Jason Cruz himself. He had installed someone new and demanded Tracy become her assistant, and when Tracy refused, he accused her of insubordination and terminated her immediately. I rushed back to the office where the atmosphere was so tense the air itself seemed to freeze, and every pair of eyes turned toward me, waiting, hoping I would act. I pushed open the office door, and there she was, Rachel Moore, leaning tearfully against Jason's shoulder, her face a portrait of fragile sorrow. Rage coursed through me, and I strode across the room, yanking her away before slapping Jason hard across the face. What right did he have to dismiss my top talent, the very woman I had fought to recruit, the one who brought in hundreds of thousands in revenue each month? Did he think this company thrived on his empty posturing and morale theatrics? Rachel shrieked, clutching his face in both hands, crying out if he was hurt. Leaning so close, she nearly pressed her lips to his, and I folded my arms, watching with a cold detachment that belied the storm inside me. I asked her if I had lost my memory, if Jason was still my fiancé, if she was actually trying to play Mistress in front of me, and her tear-filled eyes hardened as she declared that she had known him first, that I was nothing more than a substitute. My laugh rang sharp, cutting through the room, as I asked if she had looked in the mirror, because I was more beautiful than she could ever dream. And what right did she have to call me a replacement when she had been nothing but a realtor yesterday and was now trying to pass herself off as an executive? Her thick skin might let her survive, but it would not save her here. Jason, unable to bear seeing his delicate flower insulted, snapped that he valued Rachel for her talent and that I should not use power as a weapon against her. I laughed again, this time colder, telling him that the women were speaking and men should be silent if they had nothing worthwhile to add. Rachel's eyes sharpened as she joined in, saying I had been born into privilege, that the entire company was carried on Jason's back, that I was just a pretty vase with no substance who dared to act as if I led. I did not waste breath arguing, because the most important thing in that moment was protecting Tracy. I pulled out my phone and called HR, directly instructing them to offer Tracy an additional $30,000 as compensation for emotional distress, to let her rest before she returned. For a moment, Rachel's eyes widened with naked envy, glimmering with greed at the thought of money, and Jason's face darkened, his lips twisting as he realized he could not stop me. Rachel's eyes widened with envy, gleaming at the thought of $30,000, and Jason's face darkened, his voice sharp and cold, as he snapped that Tracy would not be returning, that the contract with Rachel was already signed, and she was now the sales manager. I looked at him calmly and told him that if I did not approve Rachel Moore joining the company, then the contract was invalid. His face twisted, and he barked that I simply could not handle another woman's presence, and if I truly had such a problem, I could leave the company myself. The air was strung tight like a bow, and just then a knock came at the door. Tracy Newman stepped inside, her eyes red, her hands trembling as she took mine gently. She begged me not to fight Jason on her behalf, her voice cracking as she explained her mother was ill and she had no strength left to give to the company, that she had only come to resign. I did not believe her entirely, but the office door remained open and our employees outside were watching every movement with bated breath. As their leader, I could not let Jason lose face in front of them. I softened my tone and pleaded with her to reconsider offering her extended paid leave with full salary. But she shook her head, thanking me with tears, insisting I had always treated her too kindly. Jason brushed past me, then striding out into the hall to announce with authority that from this day forward, Rachel Moore was the new sales manager, and that anyone who dared disrespect her would answer to him. Rachel stepped forward with an air of feigned poise, smiling sweetly, as she offered to buy everyone coffee that afternoon. But the room remained silent. No one accepted, no one cared to acknowledge her because she might have been able to sell luxury condos, but in the world of pet accessories, she was utterly clueless. Still, she had the audacity to bring her daughter Chloe to the product photo shoot as if it were some casual family outing. The child darted around the studio, pulling at props, until she grabbed hold of the photographer's camera. His face went pale as he snatched it back, his voice strained as he tried to remain polite, telling her gently that the equipment was not a toy, and she could not be allowed to touch it. He glanced around nervously, muttering that such distractions would slow the entire shoot, and only then did Rachel lazily lift her head and announce that Chloe was her daughter. She laughed lightly, suggesting they let Chloe pose with a cat, insisting that a child holding a kitten would make a charming shot. I sat back and nearly choked on my own laughter, because even from the back of the room I could see the photographer's frown harden. He was too professional to say it outright, but his words were clear enough. Children were difficult to control, they could get scratched, and models had to meet certain standards. In other words, he was politely saying the girl wasn't fit. My laughter slipped out sharp and cutting, and Rachel's face drained of color. She snapped that he was insulting her daughter, that if they were going to be so unprofessional, she might have to reconsider the contract. The photographer looked toward me in desperation, and I simply waved a hand, telling him to continue as planned. He understood instantly and ignored Rachel's tantrum, refocusing on the actual shoot. Just then, Chloe bolted onto the stage, her little hand grabbing the thick, fluffy tail of the star of the shoot, a cat with over 3 million followers online. She tugged hard and screamed that she wanted to rip it off to play with catnip, and the poor cat, terrified and in pain, whipped around and sank its teeth into her hand. Her wails pierced the studio like sirens. Rachel flew forward like a mad woman, her heel striking out as she kicked the helpless animal across the floor. The cat landed, hard blood trickling from its mouth, its body convulsing in shock. I rushed forward, heart pounding, and bent down to check its breathing, relieved to find it still alive, though barely. Fury shot through me, boiling over as I rounded on Rachel, shouting what kind of lunatic kicked a cat? What kind of mother could not even control her own child, screaming that she was worthless? I told her to her face that this cat was worth more than the two of them combined, that she must have sold not only houses, but also her brain if she thought this was acceptable. Rachel cowered, clinging to her crying child, too shaken to speak, and at that exact moment, Jason stormed in. Without a word, he shoved me hard, forcing me back into a chair, pain searing through my lower back as my hands instinctively flew to my stomach. My assistant, Samantha Green, ran to me, her face pale, asking if I was all right, and I gasped out instructions to get me to the car to call an ambulance to take the cat to emergency care immediately. But Jason, blind with rage, kicked the dying cat again, his voice roaring through the room as he raged that it was only an animal, that it had dared hurt a child, that anyone with a conscience should see that Chloe deserved to be saved first. Jason roared like a madman, shouting that none of us had any conscience, that the cat was just a beast and had hurt a child, and that Chloe's life should take priority over everything. He clutched the sobbing girl to his chest, trembling with a father's desperation that made me want to scream. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached, staring at him with cold fury as the words slipped from my lips like venom. Did he truly believe this child was his? Did he really not see the truth? I told him straight that Chloe was the product of Rachel's one reckless night after a drunken party, that he was wearing another man's shame while parading around pretending to be a noble stepfather. My voice rose as I spat out that he was nothing more than a fool, a man so stupid he wore horns proudly. and still begged for the privilege of being a substitute father. His face went pale, his mouth opened, but no words came, and for a moment he looked as if the ground had given way beneath his feet. I repeated it clearly, enunciating every syllable, calling him a fool. Again, stripping away every illusion. Jason turned to Rachel with haunted eyes, his voice cracking, begging her to tell him it was not true to swear, that Chloe was really his child. Rachel broke into tears, her face blotchy as she sobbed that they needed to save the girl first, that she had been bitten, that she would explain everything later. When the ambulance finally arrived, the two of them had the audacity to push forward, as if they could shove me aside and claim priority. I raised my hand, signaling to security, and ordered them to block Jason and Rachel. If they wanted medical care, they could call their own taxi. My child came first, and the cat whose life hung in the balance came first. Before I climbed into the ambulance, the cat's owner arrived in a rush, her face twisting with anguish as she saw her beloved pet bleeding and trembling on the floor. She burst into tears, her voice cutting through the air, as she demanded how any company could allow such cruelty, vowing she would post every detail online. Rachel shrank in shame, curling inward, pulling at Jason's sleeve as if his presence could shield her. Her weak voice trembled as she insisted the cat had attacked Chloe first, but Jason, shattered and silent, could only pat her shoulder. His mind still stuck on the truth I had unleashed. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed my baby was still safe, though I was ordered to rest. Relief flooded me, but anger soon returned boiling hot. I called the cat's owner, directly apologizing with sincerity, knowing she was a well-known blogger in the animal lover community. Normally, she never lent out her pets, and the fact that she had agreed to let her cat be photographed had been a rare kindness. Now, her beloved companion was fighting to live. I transferred $150,000 immediately from the joint account I shared with Jason, paying full compensation. She was furious, but when she heard I was pregnant and hospitalized, she softened, accepted the money, and told me to take care of myself. Still lying there in that sterile hospital room, fury coursed through me so fiercely, I thought my chest would burst. I had once thought to leave Jason, slowly, carefully choosing the right moment. But now, after he and that woman had nearly cost me my child and destroyed the company's reputation, I knew I could not afford to let him walk away so easily. Then, as if fate had timed it cruelly, a video hit the trending charts online. It was edited to pieces, showing only the moment the cat lunged at Chloe, then me shouting furiously at Rachel, my words spliced together to sound damning. The captions painted me as heartless, the cruel fiancé who said the cat was worth more than a child. The internet exploded the video, racking up hundreds of thousands of views within hours, fueled by paid promotions. Hashtags accused me of being soulless, a monster who valued an animal over human life. Some demanded my face, my identity baying for blood. Others tried to defend me, pointing out that the cat was famous for being gentle. That viral clips often twisted the truth, but their voices were drowned beneath the avalanche of outrage. Samantha Green tried to calm me, begging me not to let the rage endanger my baby. I clenched my phone so tightly I thought the screen might crack, and called Jason directly. He answered with fury in his voice, snarling that he was at the hospital with Chloe, that the bite was deep, that I had no idea how serious it was. I laughed bitterly, reminding him that the girl had provoked the cat first. He roared that I had no humanity, that she was just a child. My voice went cold as ice. I told him the wedding was off, the engagement was over, and that we were finished. Then I texted my mother, telling her simply that I was pregnant, that Jason had a child outside our relationship, and that I was leaving him. Her reply came swiftly, calm but firm. "Keep the baby," she wrote. "Marriage or no marriage, that part is your choice." My mother replied almost instantly, telling me to keep the baby and reminding me that marriage or no marriage was entirely my decision. Jason's voice, when I spoke to him again, had turned cold as ice. He said he was tired of serving a spoiled heiress like me, that he didn't need my family's factory anymore, and demanded that I transfer his shares to his account. In the background, I could hear Rachel's whiny voice calling him honey, telling him Chloe was crying again, and begging him to come hold their daughter. I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity of it all. He had truly embraced his role as the nation's most pathetic cuckold. Once I cut ties with Jason, I launched my counterattack. My grandfather called asking what exactly had happened, though in the end, all he cared about was reminding me not to let the factory's orders fall behind. My parents pressed me to explain every sordid detail, but even then, no one stopped to ask me what I really wanted. I felt a bitter sort of amusement in that realization, but I didn't let it distract me. What mattered most was shifting the tide of public opinion. Rachel leaned into her performance with tears and trembling hands, spinning the story online, and launching a donation campaign claiming that her daughter had gone into septic shock after the cat bite and was now in the ICU. A swarm of seeded accounts pushed the narrative painting Chloe as clinging to life, and Rachel as a tragic mother abandoned by the cruel fiancé. I immediately reached out to the photographer who had been shooting that day, asking if he still had the footage. He faltered before confessing that the memory card had been lost. My lips curled in a cold smile. I asked him how much Jason had paid to make it disappear and promised to pay triple. His face crumpled under the weight of his own guilt, but in the end he admitted the card was gone because the camera itself had been bought outright by someone else. Soon after Jason posted wedding photos online, Rachel was draped in a pure white gown, lifting her hand to flaunt a sparkling diamond ring. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to walk through the wrong person to find the right one." My response was a single line in the comments, "Isn't your daughter supposed to be dying in the ICU? How do you have time to get married?" They screenshotted my comment and uploaded it to TikTok with mocking captions. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. Jason even had the gall to call me his tone sharp with warning. He said the original video was gone forever, that the narrative now belonged entirely to him and Rachel, and that I'd be wise to stay silent. I rested my hand against the swell of my belly, feeling the baby stir, and whispered into the phone that he was a fool. He hadn't even bothered to get a DNA test for Chloe, had he? But I suspected it was already too late for him, because at that very moment, the cat's owner made her move. She released a short clip filmed by her own team footage she always had shot whenever her beloved pet was modeling. The clip showed with perfect clarity that it was Chloe who had grabbed the cat's tail, causing it to lash out in fright. In just a few seconds of raw truth, the tide of public opinion turned sharply. Longtime fans of the cat, who had followed its account for years, flooded the comments defending it, insisting it was the gentlest animal imaginable and could never have attacked without reason. As debates raged online, I used the official account of the event organizers to release the full unedited video, including the damning moments when Jason and Rachel both kicked the injured cat across the studio. I also disclosed the compensation I had already paid, proving my sincerity. Public outrage exploded. My company was cleared of blame instantly. Jason and Rachel were ripped apart online, labeled hypocrites, frauds, and homewreckers. At headquarters, 2 official termination notices were pinned to the top of our corporate social media. Rachel had been found engaging in inappropriate conduct with a colleague in the break room, and she had repeatedly brought her child to professional shoots, disrupting the workflow. After careful review, the company decided to terminate her contract and hold her personally responsible for all damages. As if that weren't enough, an anonymous source leaked Chloe's medical file. It revealed the truth that she had only received a routine rabies shot, was never admitted to the ICU, and had never once been declared in critical condition. The sympathy narrative collapsed in an instant, and Jason and Rachel were condemned more viciously than ever. Everywhere they went, they were spat on in comment sections and mocked in the streets as rats scurrying through the dark. Meanwhile, Tracy Newman, the star saleswoman Jason had once arrogantly fired, resurfaced back in her hometown. She launched her own personal media channel, telling stories from her career with a sharp edge and dripping bitterness, and in just one episode, millions of viewers learned the ugly truth about Jason and Rachel. In one bitter video recounting old workplace grudges, millions of viewers were finally shown the true faces of Jason Cruz and Rachel Moore. The money Jason had wasted on staged wedding publicity was like a drop of water in the ocean, meaningless against the tidal wave of disgrace. Before he could even try to recover, the real estate developers began pressing him for the second payment on the villa, warning that if he failed, he would lose his deposit entirely. $25 million had once rolled so easily off his tongue, but now he could not scrape together $500,000. Then one day he appeared at my door, gaunt and hollow-eyed, clutching a DNA report. The moment he saw me, his eyes bulged at the sight of my rounding belly. He stammered, asking why I had not told him I was pregnant, his voice desperate, his hands shaking. I instinctively shielded my stomach, lying without hesitation, telling him I had never said the child was his. That telling him anything would have been far too presumptuous. He collapsed to his knees, begging, his voice breaking, as he cried that Rachel had deceived him, that Chloe was not his daughter after all, that he had been wrong, and pleading with me to give him another chance to buy the apartment I had once chosen to marry him and start again. I shook my head, my throat tight, but my resolve firm, telling him it was impossible, that he was tainted, that I would never touch a man who had already been someone else's plaything, a man who had no shred of dignity left. He stared up at me, stunned, whispering that at least my baby deserved a father, that he did not care if it was biologically his or not, that as long as it was mine, he would love it. The absurdity of it made me laugh bitterly. I had sacrificed so much to protect this child, casting him aside in the process, and now he had the audacity to come crawling back, begging to play the role of surrogate father. Suddenly, a shrill voice sliced through the air. It was Rachel, shrieking outside my door, calling him a traitor, declaring he had no right to leave her. She screamed that she would never consent to a breakup. At that moment, my family's housekeeper arrived with a basket of homegrown vegetables, and Jason, never having seen him before, lunged at him with insane fury. He seized the old man by the collar and punched him square in the face, spitting accusations that he must be my lover. I did not hesitate. I called the police immediately, and because I had already instructed my housekeeper not to settle privately, the case went forward. It was ruled a minor assault, but it was enough. Both Jason and Rachel were thrown into jail. After years of scheming and betrayal, this was the pitiful end of Jason Cruz. Before being taken away, he turned to me with eyes full of despair, begging that I still loved him, reminding me of the 3 years we had spent together, asking if they meant nothing. I looked at him steadily, and after a moment told him the truth. Those 3 years, they were nothing but bad luck. When he finally emerged from prison, Jason found no place willing to hire him. Penniless and disgraced, he slunk back to his family home, only to be met with scorn. His relatives greeted him with mocking laughter, his sister-in-law sneering that he had once bragged about marrying into a wealthy family. And now he had crawled back from jail in shame. Unable to endure the humiliation, he lashed out at her in a violent fight until his brother, in rage, struck him across the skull with a wooden staff. Jason survived, but only half of him did, his body left broken and paralyzed. Rachel Moore no longer spoke of true love, of fate, or of promises. Yet Jason clung to her like a drowning man clutching driftwood. The two of them dragged each other down year after year, their lives reduced to endless squabbling and mutual torment. By the time Jason reached 50, his body gave out and he died in weakness, a shadow of the arrogant man he had once pretended to be. As for me, after all the storms and betrayals, I finally stepped into the calmest, happiest chapter of my life. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.